Welcome back from fans. I'm Chris, and back with me is Rob, fresh off his honeymoon, and it is time to discuss the Wild Season 3 finale, the answers, and of course, all the new questions. And we can finally say we have some firm answers. So, Rob, how do you think the reincarnation works? Is it only Jade and Tabitha, now known as Jabitha, or is everybody part of the cycle?
I think it's not everyone in town. I know you and I disagree a little bit, and I'll let you do your piece on this too, but I don't think it's everyone in town. I think it's the key players and probably the people who were originally in town whenever this event occurred. But everybody else is kind of just unlucky bystanders, like all those on the bus who were just taken out immediately after they got there.
Fair enough. I think the other way. I think that everybody in town is supposed to be in town and serve some sort of a function, and nobody's there just by chance, like cannon fodder. People like Toby that came with Jade, they're all supposed to be there.
One thing we definitely can't disagree on anymore, though, is what the monsters are, or at least how they were made, in a pretty grisly way, now that we've learned that they were created by the sacrifice of the Ankui children.
So it looks like, at least in our opinion, in the initial incarnation of the town, this group of people, which is now the monsters, decided to sacrifice these children to said entity for immortality. Now, back in this time frame, it was not uncommon for towns and villages to worship entities when their crops weren't doing good, when they needed something, and they would sacrifice animals or people or whatever to get the desired result. But immortality is a super selfish request, and it does not come across to be one of those situations. So we think that even if they believed in entities in general, this particular group took these children from everyone and sacrificed them to the entity and were reborn as immortal monsters. The problem is, it's like the Wishmaster movie where they ask for immortality. I don't think this is what they expected to get.
A less than ideal existence, right? It's that we use the Wishmaster as one because that's an entity that's granting these wishes. If you've seen that movie, but you could also kind of equate this to the monkey's paw situation, where if you're not clear enough with your wish, you kind of end up with not exactly what you were hoping for, but it still came true. So not the ideal situation for these monsters, which also leads into when we had Jasmine telling the guy in Colony House early on that they're stuck there as well. And yeah, porn stash. they don't want to be there really either, and that they're trapped just like the rest of the people. So that definitely gives us an answer. So we're starting to get those building blocks.
And I think because of why they're there, the reason the monsters fight back, it could be out of hunger, because in order for a monster to be born, Fatima had to drink blood, which makes us think that maybe the monsters are eating the insides that they take from their victims, because it's always been up for debate. Are they eating it, or are they just like leaving it for something other thing to eat? And I think they might be eating them now that we've seen how they're born. But because of how they were created, I think their goal is to stop Tabitha and Jade and whatever reincarnation version of them from completing the cycle, because it probably, in my opinion, will take away their immortality. I think the monsters are immortal as long as the deal stands as is. But if Tabitha and Jade are able to finish saving the children, then the monsters will die.
Yeah, at least like permanently, right? Because we've seen Smiley be
Right,
quote
right.
unquote
Yeah, permanently.
unalived, and yeah, that's how the cycle ends, and we don't have these reincarnated people just continuously pulled back into town. I do think that gives us at least an end game, right? I think that's another thing we've been trying to figure out for a long time of what is the end game of the town and the evil piece. And one other thing I do want to call out about the immortality and kind of the rebirth of these monsters is something you picked up on more than I did, but the cave drawing of the red Cthulhu squiggly squid monster. It might not actually be a monster based on what you picked up, and I kind of see where you were headed with it.
I mean, I think it is a monster. I think it's just that it's the monsters when they're being born. I think what we looked
Okay,
at on
fair.
the
I see
cave,
what you did there. Yeah, yeah.
I think that the cave wall, because when they go down there, Victor tells Tabitha, "Look, they draw too," and it makes the most sense that the monsters would draw their own history opposed to something else, the squid monster. But that really looked like Smiley when he was standing up and the sack remnants were laying down, like it was almost like a cape. It looked very much like the squid monster. So what I think we saw there was the sacrifice of the children and the rebirth of the monsters as immortals. I think they probably all had to get reborn that way at one point when they first took their monster form. They might have been killed or changed or whatever. But interestingly enough, though, they come up naked, which means they have to get dressed. They're picking those clothes on purpose. And we haven't really figured out why they're wearing those clothes. And we also don't know why they're clean every friggin' night, because they should be dirty and they must be having some sort of reset. They also were all in their human form while watching the birth and not in their monster forms underground, which was interesting too.
Now, I do think one answer for the clothing that they're wearing could just be that they're taking the clothing from the previous cycle, which would line up with the fact that Victor's cycle would have probably started around the 1980s, so we'd be seeing clothing from maybe the 1960s, which would also point us to the direction that the cycle we're in is still the cycle that Victor and Miranda and Eloise started.
Yeah, I think Eloise is probably still alive. Victor seemed unsure of it a few times, so it makes the most sense. Plus, he's mentioned how good she is at hide and seek. She could be the noises at the settlement, or she could also be a story walker like Julie, and that's why she's not able to be seen, but she's still out there and not, and she's still alive.
Yeah, this Julie information that we got this episode seems to be the biggest twist that we got. I think we've obviously gotten a glimpse of with the end scene of her coming and finding Jim with her short new haircut to show that she's not the same Julie that we just saw. But I kind of see a superhero montage coming at some point in the next season of her trying to figure out how to harness these skills, because maybe that is something that Eloise has done, to your point.
Yeah, I mean, it would seem unlikely that she's having a seizure in the middle of the runes every time this happens. So if she really is traveling up and down the storyline, she can't just have a physical body out there seizing all the time. That seems unlikely, unless she has Ethan with her and he like pulls her out of it every time, like a sidekick kind of situation. I guess that could happen, but it seems more likely that, to your point, she's honed her skills and maybe Eloise has done the same. Does that mean that every cycle has a story walker who's playing outside the rules a little bit? And is Ethan right and she can't change the story? Because if that's the case, her new role becomes irrelevant. I like to think that either Ethan's wrong or she'll find a way to play between the lines a little bit to make that happen. Because if not, it seems like an irrelevant point.
I know you actually were the one that described it to me a little bit that helps understand it, but it's called the block time theory, where if it's going to happen, it already happened. And I think the best example of that is her being the one that throws the rope down to Boyd, like we learned, because that was obviously another big answer. I thought it was cool that we kind of circled back around to it, but that happened regardless, even if she was coming back in time, per se. That could be what we're looking at, where Ethan's saying she can't manipulate it, but maybe what she does is going to happen no matter what.
I won't go on too long about this because I don't want the episode to last forever. But the reincarnation, to me, leads us to believe that these people, they die, they come back, their souls learn what happened last time, and they move forward, hoping to break the cycle by getting better each time. Kenny brings us up at the end of season 2 in episode 10, talking to Christy about the whole sweater conversation. You're a thread in a sweater, you don't see the big picture. Maybe what we do will help the next group get out. The next group is probably them again, which means that maybe he's talking about soul knowledge. All the things they did help their souls get better for the next time, and eventually they become enlightened, quote unquote, because that's how the reincarnation theory looks at it, and they get out. If that's the case, then I don't think we have multiple timelines. And then it throws Julie's time travel ability, what that means, into question. Not that it isn't there, but how it functions and what it means. Is she just working in a linear timeline and she can only follow that story? Or is every cycle a chapter in the storybook of saving the children? When she appears to Jim, she seems to be telling him this is when this happens, which is the man in yellow, which leads me to believe that she's seen this over and over and over. That's how I took that particular scene.
It seemed to me as in this was a turning point. I think you're really onto something with the she's jumping between the chapters, kind of like how Ethan says, but this key moment was when it happened. Whether it's even referring to Jim being just absolutely owned by the man in yellow, or if it's when the man in yellow arrives. But one way or another, this was a key turning point that she was trying to get back to for whatever reason.
Yeah, the whole scene kind of throws me. I'm not sure if I think it was a key turning point in the cycle as much as a key turning point for her personally, watching her father die over and over and over and over and over. And maybe this is the scene that she saw in her head against the wall when she was chained up, watching all these outcomes fail over and over and over and over and over. And that's what was so terrifying. Maybe she was just being forced to run on that time travel treadmill, seeing all the things happen. And it's just terrifying to watch that much death and failure for countless cycles. That could be what she was seeing. What I found odd was Jim's death in general. And we can kind of move into that Man in Yellow and Jim scene. The Man in Yellow, to me, seems like, if not the biggest boss, definitely a step above the monsters of what we've seen so far, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's at least a daywalker. He's the one talking on the radio and taunting Jim. So he seems to have more of an omniscient feel, and he's not bothered by the same things the monsters are. That's at least from what we can tell. There's no talismans around. He's like a leveled up monster. I don't understand why he felt the need to personally come and kill Jim. So I have a theory on it, and you might think I'm wrong. I don't know if it's a theory as much as just Jim's role. I think what you and a lot of the fandom didn't like about Jim is that Jim was overly logical and overly skeptical of other people's quote unquote crazy ideas. Even though I think it was probably right to question some of the wild stuff people were saying, because just because you're in a crazy place doesn't mean people don't go crazy. I feel like maybe Jim's role was to keep Tabitha and Jade from getting to the point they were at, to question things, to make her feel like she was going crazy or not on the right track. And when that inevitably didn't work, and they got back to that point in the cycle where Jade and Tabitha reach enlightenment, they find out what they are, the Man in Yellow comes in and disbands of Jim, right? Just gets rid of him. Maybe that was the role he's supposed to play and it didn't work, and they'll do it again next time. It didn't make sense to me that the Man in Yellow comes down and deals with Jim for no apparent reason. Jim, although a main character in the show, doesn't seem to have any real threat to the story.
I'll just add a little bit of color that I really just didn't like Jim as a person. I agree, there's definitely more meaning to the fact that he came to take care of himself. I really do think, to your point, his job was either done or he failed at it, and that was the reason. I also think there's a chance maybe this was just the introduction of the Man in Yellow. I don't think he runs roughshod through the town and starts taking out everyone, but maybe this was just the beginning.
So do you think the Man in Yellow is coming because the cycle is ending and he's finishing it off and doing the next, and kind of like rebooting things for the next try? Or is the the Man in Yellow, the next, the next thing that Martin's talking about as far as like the tip of the spear? Is he the next thing they have to deal with, and the cycle isn't over? We're going to get a lot of Man in Yellow. It's not they're pulling up in an RV again and the cycle's back to
I
beginning
think
as new
it's
characters.
I do think it's a bit of like a potentially a final boss kind of situation where, to tie it back into Lost, I know that they're the writers of Lost and everybody likes to compare Jacob and his brother in Lost. It's a similar kind of analog where we're finally getting the reveal of what this larger power is in the area. Also, to Lost, I wanted to call it out. They had to get a stinking hatch in this show, so that's kind of how I see it, is that we're at least getting finally introduced to this biggest fish in the pond.
Okay. I mean, fair enough. So, as far as the Man in Yellow goes, I'm going to say this before I mention any particular specifics of who the Man in Yellow might be, because I don't think that this show is directly tied to any specific lore. I don't think it's tied to Fae. I don't think it's tied to Ragnarok. I don't think it's tied to any of that stuff. I think they grabbed a little bit of each thing and made an entirely unique story on their own. I don't think we're going to find a one-to-one ratio for anything, because despite how much time me and Rob put into searching through the lore, and not just us, a countless amount of other people on Reddit, Facebook, and YouTube, there's never a one-to-one ratio. With that said, there is some similar deities that the Man in Yellow could be based off of. One is obviously the King in Yellow, right? Hastor. And the land he rules, Carcosa, is definitely similar to the From land in some ways. If you haven't read The King in Yellow, it's a book. You can read all about him. It's a powerful entity that controls land called Carcosa, and it's got a lot of stuff. It's built upon stolen fragments of other worlds, malevolent entities, and a nightmarish domain. Tons of stuff like that. It's interesting. Mara is another one. Mara is Buddhist cosmology, and it's a figure associated with rebirth, death, and desire. And Mara is supposed to be the force that opposes enlightenment and uses temptation, moral conflict, and outward evil to stop people. So if we are seeing this as the Wheel of Life, then the big demon on the outside of the Wheel of Life could be Yama, the death demon, or Mara, who's there to throw people for a loop to let them not reach enlightenment. And that could be someone that he was based off of, this overarching entity. But in no way do I think that it's a direct one-to-one correlation, because I do not think that there is any one-to-one correlations in this show at this point. I think it's mostly a unique piece of media. And that will wrap up this episode. As usual, we want to hear your thoughts. And if you have a topic we didn't cover, Drop it in the comments so we can all discuss it. And if you like what we're doing, let us and the algorithm know by liking and subscribing. It helps out the channel, and we really appreciate it. Until next time, stay sleuthy.